Be in 1 Samuel chapter 17 tonight, if you'd like to turn there, please. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Last week we left off after concluding the 16th chapter, and we were introduced to David, who was just a shepherd boy. He was the youngest of all 7 of Jesse's sons. Remember, the prophet Samuel came, and he came to Jesse's house, and he said, "The Lord has sent me here to find the next king." And so Jesse proudly paraded his firstborn son Eliab, and then his second and third, all the way down through the 6th. But with each one, the prophet said, "Nope, not this one. Nope, not this one." And eventually, he picked that final kid. He said, "Do you have any more kids?" And Jesse said, "Well, I have David, but he's out there with the sheep. He's my youngest. He's my baby." And that was the one that ended up being picked as king. We left last week by seeing that David, because he was good at playing the harp, was actually summoned to the palace where he would play his instrument for King Saul. God sent that distressing spirit to torment Saul so that the only thing that would soothe him would be somebody to play their instrument. So we left off last week by saying that David, the future king, but kind of secret, Saul couldn't know he was the future king or he'd kill him. And yet here David is now sitting around the king, learning about palace life, how to be king, and he's doing that because of his instrument. But we see in the next chapter that he's not there all the time. He's there for whenever Saul needs him, but he has the freedom to go back to Bethlehem from time to time and feed his father's sheep. I love this about David. Here he is as the prince. Now, nobody knows it yet outside of his family, but he's going to be king. Here he is with a position in front of the king where he can see the king whenever he wants to, and he could brag about this, especially to his older brothers. Anybody here have siblings? Anybody here that younger one? And if you have anything you can use against your older brothers or against your older sisters, you want to use it, right? He's probably been the one they picked on. Probably look at the life of Joseph, I imagine, probably very similar. All these older brothers, they probably beat him up. They probably make him do all the things they don't want to do. They boss him around. And this is probably David's shot where he could go back home and say, "Hey, Eliab, remember that time that you were rejected as being king and they picked me? Yeah, you go feed the sheep, Eliab." He could go to his older brothers and say, "Guys, I've got plenty of stuff to do. Last thing I need to do is go out there and be attacked by a bear or attacked by some kind of a lion because I'm Israel's future king. So you guys go out there into harm's way. I'm just going to go relax in the house and you guys take care of it." But that's not what David does. He leaves Jerusalem, goes back to Bethlehem to tend to his father's sheep. Despite the fact that he's the future king, taking care of his dad's sheep was not beneath him. And that's a good lesson in humility. It shows us that he doesn't, like Joseph did. Remember, Joseph would tell his brothers about his dream. "Hey, I had a dream last night that all of you guys, including Dad, y'all were bowing down and paying homage to me." David's not doing that. He's not lording this over them. He's not in any way that we know of trying to get out of work or to make them feel like they are beneath him, which is part of the reason why he was chosen to start with. Remember what God told the prophet told Jesse? "Man, we look on the outward appearance, but God sees the heart." And this gives us a glimpse into David's heart, the character that he had, what kind of person that he was. That's why he was chosen over his brothers to start with. So David, when this story picks up, we're going to see that David is back in Bethlehem. You are probably familiar with 1 Samuel chapter 17 because this is the famous event of David and Goliath. I would imagine there's not a person here that has not heard it at least a half a dozen times in your life, has not read the text. Some of you have taught this to children, whether it be in Awana or children's church, maybe even in the old days of flannel graph. You guys remember the flannel graph? When I was a kid in children's church, that's how we learned the Bible, is the teacher would stand there and stick a character on that flannel graph board. And I can go back in my mind to 2nd grade, 3rd grade, and I can remember David and Goliath from the earliest days that I went to church. And so you are probably like me and have known this story, many of you, for decades. But when that happens in the Bible, when it's something that we know like the back of our hand, sometimes we need to forget that we know it for a minute. And we need to read through it as if we've never heard it before. And so I don't want you to tune out tonight and say, "Oh yeah, David and Goliath, all right, hey, let me get on Facebook here and let them think I'm on my Bible app," okay? Don't do that. Just because you know David and Goliath, stay with me here as we're going to go through this passage. So if you're in chapter 17, we're going to meet that giant right away. The first thing we see tonight is Goliath's challenge, because he issues a challenge to the entire army of Israel. We'll pick up in the first verse. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle." And they were gathered, and by the way, there's going to be some cities and things in here and landmarks. It's not important as far as the pronunciation and even knowing where all they are tonight. Let's just stick with the story. So we'll go down to verse 2. It says, "Saul and his men were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and they drew up in line in the battle against the Philistines. Now the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And now there came up from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him." So here's his challenge, verse 8. "He stood and he shouted to the ranks of Israel, 'Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us.' And the Philistines said, 'I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together.' When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." We're introduced here to Goliath of Gath. Goliath was a giant. As the text indicates here, it tells us, and the measurements might not mean as much to us. Even in newer translations, it doesn't, unless you have one that I haven't seen, but it doesn't give us his height in feet and inches. But even in a newer translation, it tells us that he was 6 cubits and a span. A cubit, the reason for that, a cubit's inexact. We don't know exactly what a cubit was. A cubit varied from person to person. Without all the tools, the specific things that we have today, a person would measure a cubit from the fingertip of their hand, from the fingertip of their middle finger to their elbow. So that was a cubit. So if you need to measure something, you could kind of trace your arm there and call it a cubit. The difference is my cubit is a little different than your cubit, no offense. But our cubits are different as we have different lengths of our arm, right? So a cubit for me might not be a cubit for you. So we don't know exactly how tall Goliath was. The average cubit, what people have estimated today, that the average cubit was about 1.5 feet, about 18 inches. Now, obviously, that would vary. David's cubit might have been smaller than his brother Eliab's cubit. And so we can't say with any certainty, but a span is like saying a half. He was 6 cubits and a span, or 6.5 cubits. So understanding 18 inches and then that extra 9 inches from a span is we believe that Goliath was approximately, and we can't go to the grave swearing this, but we believe Goliath was about 9 feet and 9 inches tall. I'd call that a giant, wouldn't you? I mean, that is a big guy. And so sometimes in the flannel graph lessons from our childhood days, Goliath might look like this huge, like this incredible Hulk guy, but who's not green. You know, I mean, he might look like this massive monster next to David. But let's think about David for a minute. If David is 5 feet tall, and there's no way to tell, he was a young guy, he might have had some growth spurts still ahead of him. But if David was just 5 feet tall, then Goliath is close to twice his size. So the flannel graph pictures may actually be pretty accurate in that regard. I mean, you take David going up against somebody where if you stacked David on top of himself, 2 Davids, he'd be about the same size as Goliath. I mean, this is not a fair fight. And so Goliath is this big guy, but sometimes there's people that are really tall, like, okay, he's 9 feet tall, but usually, like you look in the NBA, the tallest people to ever play in the NBA, there's been, I think, 3 of them over the years that were 7'6". Yao Ming might have been 7'7". I could be wrong on that. But guys like George Murasan, Manute Bol, anybody remember those guys? Manute Bol was 7 feet 6 inches tall. but he was about as thin as a toothpick. Manute Bol was not a strong, powerful guy. He's tall, but he wasn't very strong. I mean, somebody could get in there and push him around. If he put his hands up, you weren't going to shoot over him, but he wasn't very physical, wasn't very strong. Goliath isn't like that. Yeah, he's 9.5 feet tall, but it's not like he's Mr. Toothpick either. Goliath was a strong person. We know that because of the armor that he carried and because of the javelin, the spear that he carried, because of the equipment that he wore, and it tells us the weight of that stuff, where somebody who's skinny as a toothpick, somebody who's tall but scrawny, would not be able to stand up under the weight of the armor that Goliath is wearing, would not even be able to carry the spear. It talks about that coat of mail, that thing that protected his chest that Goliath wore, and it measures it for us in bronze shekels. And so if you're not familiar with weight of bronze shekels, it's estimated that coat of mail that he wore around his chest weighed 125 pounds. It'd be pretty hard to hurt a guy who has 125 pounds worth of armor protecting his chest. But think about the physical stamina it would require to carry that type of weight on your upper body. You might be able to hold it, you might be able to wear it, you might be able to walk around for a little bit, but that would take a tremendous toll to walk around with that kind of weight. You guys that are in the army or that have served, I know that you wear those backpacks that are heavy and you have to train and condition carrying that stuff. But to think that Goliath walked around with 125 pounds on him, just on his chest. Now, he had the helmet that was also very heavy. He had the armor on his legs, it tells us, to protect his shins and his lower body. When maybe you were trying to get in shape or train, maybe you played sports, maybe you played football, you were trying to get in shape, and you put weights on your legs. You put them around your ankles so that you would run, and your legs had to work a little bit harder. That's what Goliath is doing, but he's not doing it to get in shape. He's doing it because he is in shape. He's doing it because he's a monster of a man, that his legs are so strong that he puts these weights on there, not to condition his legs, but it doesn't bother him any. He does it just for protection. And then that spear, it's estimated his spear weighed about 15 pounds. Imagine trying to throw anything that weighs 15 pounds. Pick up a 15-pound dumbbell and imagine trying to throw it like a person would throw a javelin with any kind of accuracy to get any kind of distance on it. If you get a 15-pound dumbbell, you might be able to throw it 10 feet and then ice your shoulder down in the morning. That would be a tremendous feat. When I was in school in PE one year, we did all the track and field stuff, and I had to throw the shot put. Anybody ever participate in shot put? A few of you guys have. That big ball, and it's really hard to do it. You can't wind up and throw it like a quarterback. You have to more or less push it forward. But Goliath has this javelin that you would think like a quarterback to wind up and throw it, and it weighs 15 pounds. It would take a monster of a man to be able to throw a 15-pound spear. And so this shows us that Goliath was tall, but he was hulking. He was incredibly powerful. He was somebody that would frighten the daylights out of anybody that met him. And so here you have the entire Israeli army. And nobody wants to take this guy on. So Goliath offers a challenge. Instead of it making it all of your army against all of ours, let's just cut to the chase here. Mano y mano. You pick your man and let him come stand against me. We'll fight to the death. And it's pretty simple. If we win, you become our servants. And if anybody can kill me, Goliath says, good luck with that. If anybody can kill me, then hey, we'll be your servants. It's a great challenge. You can avoid war by just having two guys square off. The problem is there's not a person in the army, in the entire Israeli army, that can stand toe-to-toe with Goliath. Maybe toe-to-toe, not eye-to-eye for sure. There's nobody that can stand against this giant. And Goliath knows that. He's described as a champion. That's a pretty good title right away, to be called a champion. This is somebody that you don't want to mess with. For all we know, Goliath has been doing this for years, these little fight-to-the-death things, like people used to have a duel. I can see somebody crossing Goliath. All right, that's it. You and me fight to the death. And Goliath knows there's nobody that can stop him. Nobody is strong enough. You get the biggest spear you've got, and you're not going to penetrate 125 pounds in his chest. And no matter what you wear to protect yourself, when that 15-pound javelin comes at you, it's going to do some damage. Even if it's not a direct hit, it's not going to feel good if Goliath makes any kind of contact with you. So twice a day for 40 days, the Bible says, Twice a day for 40 days. He'd come out in the morning. All right, guys, who's going to fight me today? And nobody would take him up on it. He'd come back in the evening. Give me a man. Give me somebody to fight against. And he would offer this challenge twice a day, day after day, for 40 days. Meanwhile, while all that's going on, David is not in the palace. He doesn't know about any of this because he's in Bethlehem taking care of his sheep. And so if you're still there in chapter 17, we'll pick up in verse 17. So 17:17, we'll read verse 18 too. And I'll turn my page. Here's what it says. And Jesse said to David his son, take for your brothers an ephah of parched grain and these 10 loaves and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. And take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000 and see if your brothers are well and bring some token from them. So David's at home and his dad says, David, I want you to take some food to your brothers. Couldn't put any money on their commissary account. They didn't have any kind of modern luxury, but he says, David, I want you to take this stuff and go give it to your brothers. Make sure they're okay. We learn here that 3 of David's oldest brothers that had been rejected as being king, but his 3 oldest brothers are here in the battle. And so his brothers are there day after day when Goliath comes and makes his challenge, but they're not man enough to stand up to Goliath. Or maybe they're just smart enough. Maybe we shouldn't call them cowards. Maybe they're realistic. Maybe they understand, hey, if it's me versus Goliath, Goliath wins every time. But nobody's willing to stand against him, not even David's brothers. And again, it's no wonder that they were rejected as being king instead of David. So, and by the way, there's a good little tidbit in here about just taking care of the right people. He says, take all this food to your brothers and the captain over thousands. Remember, they had captains over tens and hundreds and thousands. You give all this cheese, you give all this good stuff to the guy that's looking out for your brothers. Sometimes it's good to give something to people just to keep them happy, right? Hey, if he wanted his sons to be doing well, you don't just give something to your brothers, David. You make sure you give their boss something good too, to make sure that he's going to look out for them. Smart on Jesse's part to make sure that they're taken care of. But he says, and bring back some token from them. He's not going to go back to the palace. He's going to return to Bethlehem. And he's saying, David, let me know that my boys are okay. Jesse can't turn on the evening news at night and see how the battle's faring. For all he knows, the 2 armies are at war. He doesn't know anything about Goliath and this challenge that's been offered. So David loads up with all these supplies and he heads out to the battle. We've seen Goliath's challenge, but number 2, we're going to see Saul's challenge. The king of Israel understands, I'd better do something about this giant. I've got to do something about this Philistine. We can't keep sitting here like cowards. It says that they were distressed. They didn't want to stand up against this giant. Saul says, I better offer a challenge. I better entice somebody to roll the dice and fight this giant. Look in verse 24. It says, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him, and they were much afraid. And the men of Israel said to David, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and he will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by, well, what will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him and said in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. Now David's brothers in the next verse, they get mad at him for coming. They said, you're just nosy. You only came up here to see what's going on. And David said, no, look, I came to bring you some supplies. But notice David says, well, what's the king going to do? What's Saul going to do to the person who's willing to fight? Goliath has offered his challenge. Well, what says Saul? What's the challenge coming from the king? And they said, well, here's what he's going to do. The king says, if anybody's willing to fight Goliath, first of all, we're going to make him very rich. It says we will enrich him with riches. We're going to give him money out of the royal treasury. We're going to make sure that he gets his due reward. Next, Saul's going to give his own daughter as a wife to whoever is willing to fight against Saul. Now, by the way, there is no consolation prize. Goliath, I said Saul. There is no consolation prize. If you fight Goliath and lose, you don't get to keep your money and your wife, because after all, if you fight Goliath and lose, you're what? Dead, right? This is a fight to the death. And so these prizes are being offered, but only somebody that thinks that they've got a chance to win. So you're going to get money, you're going to get rich, you're going to get to marry the princess, right? You're going to get to have the king's own daughter as your wife. But then the next thing, it says her father's house would be free. That means free from paying taxes. That's a pretty good, I would definitely have argued for that during the negotiations. By the way, I never want to pay taxes again as long as I live. That's what King Saul is saying. If you fight Goliath, your father's family, or your family in essence, you'll never pay taxes again. That's a pretty good package that's being offered here, right? Going to make you rich, going to give you the princess, and you'll never pay taxes as long as you live. And David hears all this, and I can just imagine him saying, well, what are they waiting for? Why wouldn't anybody take him up on this offer? This is a pretty good offer, but David's concern is not even financial. David is worried in verse 26. He says about this Philistine that would defy the armies of the living God. For David, it's more about the fact that this giant would insult the living God. This giant would run his mouth, that he would mock us. Because if you mocked Israel, you weren't just mocking the people, you weren't mocking the king, you were mocking the God that they represented. Israel was so unlike any other nation in the Old Testament. They were so intertwined with the living God, they called him, that you didn't separate God and Israel. If you mocked Israel, you're mocking God. And David says, well, what are we going to do about this uncircumcised Philistine? Just means he's not a Jew. He's not one of us. What are we going to do about this guy that's mocking, that's defying our God? That's David's chief concern. And he wants to do something about it. So number 3, we're going to see that David offers his own challenge. Goliath has a challenge on the table. Saul puts out his challenge, and now David's going to step up to the plate. Look in verse 31, please. It says, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. So David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant, meaning me, I will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine and fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear that took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, and I struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. Why? Because he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Saul was really running out of options. David, you can't do it. You're a kid. Goliath has been killing people since he was a kid. You don't stand a chance against him. But at the end of it, he says, all right, what choice do I have? It's been 40 days. We don't have anybody willing to step up. So David, good luck, buddy, and may the Lord be with you. Finally, he relents and he lets David do it. But look at David. This is an impressive resume. David, you're just a kid. You're just a shepherd. You can't, oh, I'm just a kid, all right. I'm just a shepherd. I'm a kid that has killed bears. I'm a kid that has killed lions. I've killed a bear. I can stand up against Goliath. It's not a bad resume for a little shepherd boy, is it? We talked last week about, oh, he's just David out there on the flock, but what courage he must have had to take care of the flock. That when a bear came, he didn't run for it and save his own tail, but he went back and he made sure that he protected his father's sheep. When a lion came and snatched him up in his mouth, he just caught him by the beard, just grabbed that lion. I mean, right there, right where those sharp teeth are. He walks up and he grabs that lion, and he teaches that lion a lesson, and he sends him on his way empty-handed. Not bad, David, I got to say. And so he says, look, this Philistine, he's going to be just like one of those lions or bears. What does that mean? Dead. I killed the lion, I killed the bear, and that Philistine, he'll be just like him. The birds came and ate the carcass of the lion and the bear, and they're going to be feasting on this giant for a long, long time. David is convinced that he's going to be able to stand against the giant. But I love again why he says it. Not because I want your money, not because I want your daughter, but he says again that he has defied the armies of the living God. David's concern is not financial. It's not that his own pride was wounded. It's not that he said, watch this, I'm going to step up and I'm going to be the man. He wants to defend the honor of his God. So Saul without very many options. We won't read all the verses, but Saul says, well, here, you better wear some armor, son. And he puts his armor on David, and it's too big and too heavy, and David can't wear it. And David says, you know what, forget all this stuff. I didn't wear any of this when there was a bear. I didn't wear any of this when the lions came, and I'm not going to wear it against Goliath. And David takes it all off, and he says, I'm going to do it the way that I've always done it. And David grabs his little slingshot, and he goes over to the brook, and he reaches down and he picks up 5 smooth stones, and he puts them in his pouch, and he says, I'm all set. I've got my staff, my walking stick. I've got my slingshot. I've got 5 rounds in the chamber, and I'm ready for battle. I mean, think about this. How many of you guys had a slingshot as a kid? You ever think that was a weapon of war? You ever, we all grew up in different eras here. You ever think, if the Nazis invade or if the Soviet Union invades, I got my slingshot and I'm going to protect my house and I won't go down without a fight. I've got 5 rocks and I'm ready to make my last stand right here. But that's it for David. I don't need a spear, don't need a javelin, don't need a shield, don't need your coat of armor. I've got my slingshot. It was good enough to beat a bear with it. It was good enough for a lion. Hey, I was barehanded when I grabbed that lion by the beard. I've got more than enough to stand against this giant. There's been a lot of speculation about why 5 stones. Why does Scripture give us the number 5? Why didn't it say he got some or 1? As far as we know, he only fired 1 shot anyway. Some said, Goliath had 4 brothers. There's nothing in Scripture to show that David was going to go kill all of Goliath's brothers. I don't know why he got 5. If I had to guess, I'd say he's just a good planner. He thought, well, I may miss, or I may hit his helmet, or I may need another round. I think David was just trying to be prepared. I don't need all that armor, but I will grab a handful of rocks here. I want to make sure that if I miss, I've got another one. And David got his 5 stones, and he went off into battle. We're going to pick up in verse 43, and we're almost finished here. But David has offered one challenge to Saul. Now he's going to offer one to Goliath. In verse 43, it says, the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh, the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day, meaning today, right now, the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down, and I will cut off your head, and I will give your dead bodies to the host, the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day, to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that I, David, am awesome. That's not what he says. All the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with a sword or a spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give me into your hand. That's pretty tough talk by a little shepherd boy, isn't it? Especially because Goliath comes out swinging first. Oh, what am I, a dog? What are we going to play fetch? I mean, David comes out here with his shepherd's staff. You're going to come to me with a stick like I'm a dog? And he tells David, you're toast, buddy. I'm going to kill you. I mean, I'm heavily armed and you've got a stick? I've been killing people like this for years and you're going to come to me with a staff? And David's not fazed at all. I mean, we don't see David terrified like everybody in the army was. David has to look up, but he looks that giant in the eye and he says, you're dead meat, buddy. He says, I'm going to knock you down. I'm going to cut off your head and I'm going to feed you to the wild animals. You better be able to back that up, David. That we tell people that all the time. When people play in sports, you like to talk a lot of trash before the big game. I always say, you're going to talk trash, you better back that up. All you're doing is getting the other team fired up, saying, all right, let me at him. And David looks at that giant and says, yeah, right, I've got a stick here. I've got a stick and a sling, but you're about to be decapitated. He didn't even have anything to cut the giant's head off with, but David was not intimidated at all. It's God that gives the victory. He said the battle belongs to the Lord, and all the earth may know that there's a God in heaven. Very tough talk, but David's about to back it up. In the next verses, David fires a single shot. And you know what they say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. One shot, and all 9 feet 9 inches of that giant hits the ground. And what a thud it must have been. When that 125 pounds of armor on his chest hit the ground, it must have been a sound, like we say, the shot heard round the world. I bet everybody, they're gathered on two mountains with a valley in between. I bet everybody in those mountaintops had an immediate reaction. Shock and awe, celebration from the Israelites, and terror from the Philistines. They just saw their 9-foot champion get knocked to the ground by a young boy with a single rock and a slingshot. The Philistines fled. The Israelites pursued after them and defeated them. And David did exactly what he said, by the way. He took Goliath's own sword and he decapitated Goliath with it. You say, oh, that's gruesome. We didn't have that part in the flannel graph, by the way. I never saw the flannel graph image of David cutting off Goliath's head. But that's what Scripture says that happened. It's exactly what David did. That's what happened in armies in those days. And by the way, still in the Middle East today. That's why ISIS does what they do and the beheadings and things, because it strikes terror in other people. David wanted the Philistines to see, and it's graphic. This wasn't murder. This is an act of war. I don't think David's being overly cruel here in any way, but he wants the Philistines to know, you don't mess with God. You don't mess with the armies of the living God. This is in no way something that tells us that jihad is okay, or that in the name of God we can go kill those that defy God or cut their heads off. That is not what I'm trying to say here at all, and that's not what David would have wanted. This was an act of war, but David wanted everybody to know, you don't mess with God. You guys remember what you just saw here today, and you don't mess with the living God. David was then given a permanent spot in Saul's army. No more sheep for you, David. You're no longer a shepherd. You're no longer just the harp player. But now, David, you're going to be in the royal army. Remember, it won't be too much longer after this. It'll be that Saul has killed his thousands, but David is 10,000s. And it's no longer bears and lions, but it starts with a giant, and then all the people in the armies that David would soon fight against. I know you've heard this story before. I know you've read through this passage before. And you've probably heard in your adult life some type of conclusion like this. Just as David stood against the giant in his life, there's giants in your life. You ever heard anything like that? And we need to stand up against the giants, or we need to be willing to face the giants in our own life. And that's a great application, great conclusion, great message. But that's not what this was all about. David wasn't trying to just tackle some problem in his life and say, all right, guys, I got to go face my giant now and tackle this problem that seems impossible. Let's not forget what David was doing. David was standing up to a brutal, murdering monster. And so I think sometimes we do a little bit of a disservice to it. And the football movie that they made, Facing Your Giants, is a great movie. But Facing Our Giants is not the other football team. David was facing a monster that could have taken his head off and taken all of Israel to be their slaves. David was facing a real life giant. The point of the story is not about tackling some little problem in your life. The reason David did what he did was not about having, oh, this seems impossible and we can do that which is impossible. David's motivating factor was that there's someone over there insulting my God. David was driven not to tackle some problem in life, not to win a sporting event, but to defend the honor of his God. And I think we would do well to keep that in mind. This is a story about God's glory, about God's integrity. And we see David wanted the world to know how good his God is. He didn't want people to think that his God was a loser. He said, if we're afraid of this giant, all this shows that our God can't deliver us. If we're not willing to stand up against this one guy, then all of those godless people, those uncircumcised Philistines, all of them will think, well, how strong is your God really, if none of you guys are willing to stand up against our champion? And he did not want them to think less of his God. And he said, I will risk my life so that the name of God may be magnified. I will stand up against a guy twice my size, height-wise, probably triple or quadruple his body weight. I will stand up against this monster so that people will stop mocking our God. I want them to know the truth, that the battle is the Lord's, that he will give the victory. Yeah, you come to me with a sword and a spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord. Yahweh, he said, I am. I come to you in his name. And I want all these people to know how good God is. I hope that you have that kind of a desire to defend God. It's the same thing that Joshua said back in the book of Joshua when they lost at Ai. And he said, now God, what will we do for your great name? Prior to the battle of Ai, they knocked down the walls of Jericho. It says everybody in Canaan, in the promised land, everybody was shut up with fear because of the name of the Lord and his army. And then right after that, they get beaten by tiny little Ai. And Joshua says, now they're mocking the name of God. What are we going to do because God's name is being mocked? Didn't care about him as the general, didn't care about Israel's reputation, but it was that of God. And he was motivated by that. David did not want God's name to be mocked, and I hope we have that same kind of passion. So that when we hear people mocking God, we don't just turn around and say, well, I don't want to start a debate, so I'm just going to go over here. I hope that we're willing to stand up and defend our God. Not that he needs us to defend him, but we ought to have that kind of desire to want to anyway. And because, as David understood, these unsaved people, these Philistines that are not Jews, they don't know about God, they will learn about him from me. So our defending God is not because God needs our defense, but it's so that the unsaved world can know the truth, that he is the Lord who saves and that there is none like him. This does not mean we become obnoxious, doesn't mean we become jerks, doesn't mean we get on a social media exchange and we start insulting people and we try to win the argument. But it does mean that we defend God. It means we stand up when we have a chance to defend him. But in order to do that, we have to know what we're talking about, right? We have to know God's word. We have to be able to do what Peter said, to be ready to give an answer at any time to anyone who asks you for a reason of the hope that lies within you. David did it that day. Right before taking down the giant, he explained himself and what he believed about his God. Before we face any giant, we better be able to give a defense of what we believe, to defend the honor of God. Because would you agree with me that there's none like him in all the earth? And so we better be willing to stand up for him. And that's the message tonight. And so I'm going to ask you to stand up where you are. In this time of invitation, if there's anything in your heart that you want to pray about tonight, this is the time. You can come forward and kneel. You can pray where you are. You heard the message tonight. Maybe God's laid something entirely different on your life, and you just want to pray. There's something on your heart, someone you want to intercede for, and you want to use this time to pray. Maybe tonight you need to get saved. You don't love God like that. It's never been a big deal to you, but you see tonight that there's none like him, and you want to give him your heart, give him your life. I'm going to pray and let you have time to do the same. You want to pray? You do that now. Lord, I pray in these next few minutes, anything that you've laid on our hearts that we would talk to you about it. Lord, some maybe tonight need to get saved. Maybe some have some things in their life that they want to pray about, to talk to you about, to intercede on someone else's behalf. Maybe they have some loved ones that they want to pray about tonight. Lord, I pray in these next few minutes we would all pour out our hearts to you. And I ask this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.